Welcome back to Room 57, where we dive deep into some of the world's most notorious true crime stories and unsettling mysteries. Today, we will be uncovering the chilling saga of one of Britain's most infamous serial killers, Peter Sutcliffe, infamously known as the Yorkshire Ripper. His reign of terror, spanning from the mid-1970s into the early 1980s, led to the brutal deaths of 13 women and left a trail of destruction that would forever haunt the streets of northern England. The case of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most gruesome and complicated criminal investigations in British history. The story of Peter Sutcliffe is one that involves brutal killings, a botched investigation, a misdirected manhunt, and a community left in fear. Sutcliffe's killing spree sent shockwaves throughout the UK and caused mass panic for years. He evaded capture, leaving the police struggling to connect the dots, and creating a climate of terror that gripped not only Yorkshire but the whole country. Despite the substantial resources and manpower devoted to the investigation, Sutcliffe managed to slip through the cracks for far too long. How did a seemingly ordinary man manage to evade justice for years? Why did the police struggle to catch him despite his multiple run-ins with law enforcement? In this video, we'll explore the terrifying details of Sutcliffe's crimes, the investigation that went horribly wrong, and the eventual capture of one of the most notorious killers in modern British history. We will take you step by step through the Yorkshire Ripper's horrifying journey and the tragic consequences that followed. Prepare yourself for a deep dive into a case filled with haunting brutality, police errors, and societal fear. Part 1. The Yorkshire Ripper. Who was Peter Sutcliffe? The early years. A modest beginning, Peter Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Bingley, West Yorkshire, into a working-class family. His early years were unremarkable, and he grew up in a relatively normal household. Although the dynamics within his family were often tense, Sutcliffe's father, John Sutcliffe, was a strict and somewhat domineering figure, and his mother, who was emotionally distant, contributed to a home environment that could be described as cold and uninspiring. Sutcliffe's relationship with his family was strained, and he often felt a sense of isolation and alienation. Peter's life before the killings didn't indicate any outward signs of violent tendencies. He worked a regular job as a truck driver and had periods of employment in various factories, making him appear like an ordinary man to the outside world. Sutcliffe's friends and co-workers didn't notice any signs of a deeply disturbed individual. In fact, to most people, he was just another man trying to make his way in the world. However, inside his mind, things were far more complicated. In 1974, Sutcliffe married Sonia Sharma, a woman who would later be swept up in the media frenzy surrounding his crimes. It is believed that Sonia knew little about her husband's violent tendencies, and their marriage was initially a quiet one. However, Sutcliffe's private world was a much darker place. His marriage to Sonia would become a central part of the story, especially when the truth of his horrific crimes began to surface. The first murders. A killer's evolution. Peter Sutcliffe's first murder took place in 1975 when he brutally attacked 28-year-old Wilma McCann, a mother of 4. Wilma was a sex worker who was found dead on the streets of Leeds, having been struck multiple times with a hammer and stabbed. Sutcliffe's method was disturbingly consistent. He would strike his victims with a blunt object, then stab them, leaving them mutilated and lifeless. The murder of Wilma McCann shocked the local community, but it wasn't the only murder. Sutcliffe's killing spree continued with the deaths of multiple women, many of whom were sex workers, but later, his victims were not exclusively from this background. His attacks became increasingly brutal and more frequent, sowing fear in the streets. The police were clueless about the identity of the killer, and there were no clear connections between the victims at first. As Sutcliffe's spree grew, so did the anxiety within Yorkshire. Women were fearful to walk alone at night, and the police were under intense pressure to solve the case. By 1977, Sutcliffe had already claimed multiple victims, and the public was in a state of panic. The Ripper moniker had a growing fear. By the time Peter Sutcliffe had committed several murders, the media had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper, comparing his killings to those of the infamous Jack the Ripper from Victorian London. This comparison only heightened the fear that was already sweeping through the nation. Sutcliffe's victims were often targeted late at night in isolated areas, where they were vulnerable and easy targets. The media frenzy surrounding the killings didn't help matters. In fact, it made things worse by sensationalizing the case and flooding the investigation with distractions. The police were under immense public pressure to catch the killer, but there were no solid leads, and the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper soon became one of the most intense and botched investigations in British history. Despite the brutality of Sutcliffe's murders, there was little physical evidence to go on. Sutcliffe had carefully planned his attacks, often selecting his victims based on their vulnerability. The women he murdered did not have any apparent connection to each other, which made it difficult for the police to establish a pattern at first. The lack of forensic evidence meant that the case became one based largely on witness reports. and gut instincts, the investigation, missteps, and misdirection as the investigation dragged on. The police made several major missteps. The biggest of these was the mishandling of the Wearside Jack hoax. In 1979, a man, who would later be identified as John Humble, sent a letter and tape recording to the police claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. This hoax sent the investigation down the wrong path, as the police believed that the killer had a Geordie Newcastle accent, leading them to focus their efforts in the wrong part of the country. This diversion added years to the investigation and gave Sutcliffe the opportunity to continue his killing spree. Furthermore, Sutcliffe was questioned by the police on several occasions, but he was never a primary suspect. He had a known history of violence and had even been involved in violent altercations with women in the past, but due to a series of police oversights, he was not connected to the murders. The public outcry was growing louder, and people were terrified. The women of Yorkshire, especially those involved in prostitution, had become targets of a merciless killer, but despite multiple interviews, no one seemed to be able to piece the puzzle together. Police, despite multiple potential leads, failed to narrow in on Sutcliffe, and the killings continued. Part 2. The Breakthrough. How Peter Sutcliffe was finally caught. The investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper's killings had been ongoing for years, filled with numerous false leads, misinformation, and missteps. Despite the mounting pressure on law enforcement and the widespread fear gripping the public, Peter Sutcliffe, the man responsible for 13 brutal murders and several other attacks, remained at large. However, in 1980, the killer's luck ran out, and his identity was finally uncovered through a series of fateful events. A fortuitous encounter with the police after several years of terrorizing Yorkshire. Sutcliffe's capture came unexpectedly. On January 2, 1981, Sutcliffe was arrested in the early hours of the morning by the police officers who were part of the regular patrol in the area. The officers stopped a vehicle in the quiet suburban streets of Sheffield, where Sutcliffe was found in the car with a woman named Olive Smelt, a sex worker. The police had no way of knowing at that time that the man they had just apprehended was the notorious Yorkshire Ripper. Sutcliffe was acting suspiciously when the officers approached the vehicle. He was alone with the woman, and the car contained some strange items, including a hammer, a wrench, and a bag with what appeared to be items linked to the killer's previous attacks. Sutcliffe's strange behavior and inability to explain the presence of these items raised the officers' suspicions. The police officers, realizing that they had stumbled upon something significant, decided to detain Sutcliffe and investigate further. This moment would prove to be a game changer in one of the most complicated criminal investigations in British history. At first, Sutcliffe had been somewhat cooperative, but as the questioning progressed, inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. The items found in his car were eerily similar to the ones used in the Ripper's previous killings. Most notably, Sutcliffe was unable to provide a credible explanation for their presence. At this point, it was clear that Sutcliffe had been acting strangely and that something was deeply wrong. The confession, the man behind the murders during the hours following his detention. Sutcliffe's demeanor changed. The police had already begun to suspect that they had caught the killer, and their questioning became more focused on the murders. At first, Sutcliffe denied any involvement in the killings, but as pressure mounted and the evidence against him began to mount, his resistance crumbled. His initial denials were replaced with an almost eerie calmness, and he eventually admitted that he had been the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe's confession shocked the investigators. He admitted to killing 13 women and attempting to murder 7 others over the course of 5 years. Sutcliffe's admission that he had been the Yorkshire Ripper was the culmination of a lengthy investigation that had seemed to be spinning its wheels for years. With his confession, Sutcliffe revealed not only the chilling details of his murders, but also the motivations behind his horrific actions. The shocking motive, Sutcliffe's dark fantasies. During his confession, Sutcliffe revealed his twisted motivations for the murders. He claimed that he was on a mission from God, that he had been driven to kill in response to what he believed was a moral imperative. Sutcliffe told the police that he believed the women he murdered were evil and that he was acting as a kind of divine avenger. He also claimed that he had been hearing voices that encouraged him to kill, reinforcing his belief that he was carrying out a higher purpose. Sutcliffe's rationalization for his actions was both chilling and disturbing. He spoke with an eerie detachment, recounting the murders in great detail, as if they were nothing more than a series of mechanical tasks he had to perform. He expressed no remorse for the lives he had taken, and his calmness while discussing the murders was unsettling for those who were involved in the case. It was evident that Sutcliffe's crimes were not the result of a singular, isolated incident, but the manifestation of deeply ingrained psychological issues. Sutcliffe's mental state was a central focus during his trial, and his defense team attempted to argue that he was suffering from a mental illness at the time of the murders. However, this claim was fiercely contested by the prosecution. The police blunders, the Wearside Jack hoaxes with many high-profile cases. The capture of Sutcliffe was not without its complications. One of the major stumbling blocks during the investigation was the infamous Wearside Jack hoax, which sent the investigation down a dangerous and misleading path. In 1979, a man who claimed to be the Yorkshire Ripper sent a letter and a tape recording to the police. The letter was written in a Geordie accent, and the tape was of the same accent, which led the police to focus their attention on a suspect who was believed to be from the northeastern region of England. The hoaxer, who would later be identified as John Humble, effectively diverted the police's focus from Sutcliffe, allowing him to continue his killing spree for longer than necessary. The hoax had a significant impact on the investigation, delaying the capture of Sutcliffe by focusing resources and efforts on the wrong geographical area. The police had been so convinced by the Wearside Jack letter and tape that they overlooked other crucial pieces of evidence that could have led them to Sutcliffe much earlier. In hindsight, the hoax was one of the most damaging mistakes of the entire investigation. Sutcliffe's arrest in 1981, however, marked the end of the reign of terror. As his confession came to light, it was clear that the police had been in pursuit of the wrong leads for far too long. The Wearside Jack hoax, while a pivotal moment in the case, was ultimately revealed to be a distraction. It was an unfortunate example of how a single piece of misinformation could have profound effects on the investigation. The trial, Sutcliffe's defense and conviction after his arrest. Peter Sutcliffe was charged with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. His trial, which began in 1981, was widely publicized and closely followed by the media. Sutcliffe's defense team attempted to argue that he was suffering from a mental illness, specifically claiming that he had been delusional when committing the murders. They sought to have him declared insane and committed to a psychiatric institution. However, the prosecution painted a different picture of Sutcliffe. They argued that Sutcliffe had been fully aware of his actions and had planned and executed his murders with chilling precision. The court rejected the insanity defense and found Sutcliffe guilty of all charges, sentencing him to life in prison. The judge described him as a highly dangerous individual who posed a threat to society. Despite his conviction, Sutcliffe's case remained controversial. In the years that followed, questions were raised about his mental state and whether he should have been held in a psychiatric facility rather than a regular prison. Sutcliffe's behavior in prison further fueled the debate, as he continued to exhibit disturbing tendencies and had occasional outbursts of violence. The aftermath, a nation shaken by the crimes Peter Sutcliffe's capture and conviction, were a relief to the people of Yorkshire and the United Kingdom as a whole. For years, the country had been living in fear of the Yorkshire Ripper, and the sense of closure brought by his conviction was bittersweet. The families of his victims were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, but there was a sense of justice at long last. However, the case also highlighted significant flaws in the police investigation and how law enforcement handled the case. The mistakes made during the investigation, particularly the distractions caused by the Wearside Jack hoax, prompted a reevaluation of how similar investigations should be conducted in the future. The lessons learned from the case influenced changes in policing practices and investigative techniques, making the Yorkshire Ripper case a landmark in both criminal justice and law enforcement history. Sutcliffe's killings also raised questions about how society views and handles cases of serial murder. His crimes, along with those of other infamous serial killers, have contributed to a broader understanding of criminal psychology and the factors that lead to such horrific acts. Conclusion: a killer's legacy and its impact on crime investigations. Story of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, is a tragic and chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. It is a case filled with missed opportunities, misdirections, and a killer who slipped through the cracks for far too long. However, his eventual capture and conviction marked the end of a dark chapter in British history, and it is a case that continues to shape our understanding of criminal investigations today. As we reflect on Sutcliffe's case, it is important to remember the victims and their families, whose lives were forever changed by his actions. The police blunders, the media sensationalism, and the mistakes made during the investigation will always be part of this tragic story, but they should not overshadow the lives of those who were affected by Sutcliffe's terror. Part 3. The investigation and public reaction. A nightmare unfolds. Initial investigations. Brutal murders attributed to the Yorkshire Ripper set the stage for one of the most intense and harrowing investigations in British history. The series of killings began in 1975, and the police response was swift but tragically inadequate. Initially, the police struggled to connect the murders, as the victims, mostly women who were working as prostitutes, seemed to fit no particular profile. At first glance, they were simply victims of street crime, but soon, it became apparent that there was something much darker and more methodical at play. The police initially relied on the assumption that the killer was targeting prostitutes due to their profession and vulnerable status. This theory dominated early investigations, leading police to focus their attention on areas with high numbers of sex workers. Yet, this approach didn't yield any breakthrough. The killer's ability to slip away without leaving substantial clues left investigators frustrated and, at times, helpless. There was no pattern in the locations, no consistent weapon, and no clear connection between the victims besides their gender and occupation. One of the most glaring mistakes was the failure to connect the first murder with the others. The first victim, Wilma McCann, had been found in 1975, but police did not immediately link her death to the others that followed. Despite forensic evidence that could have helped them piece together the case, investigators failed to recognize the pattern early enough. Public panic and the media frenzy as the bodies of women continued to pile up. The public reaction shifted from shock to fear. The media played a massive role in creating widespread panic across the northern part of England, particularly in Yorkshire. The press had a field day, with sensationalized headlines describing the killer as an elusive monster, beast, or devil. The term Yorkshire Ripper was coined. As the media fed into the growing hysteria around the killings, every woman in the area became a potential victim, and the fear was palpable. The Yorkshire Ripper did not discriminate. His victims were from all walks of life, although most were working-class women. As the murders continued, so did the fear of becoming the next target. What made matters worse was the public's increasing lack of trust in the police's ability to catch the killer. Every time another woman was found dead, the belief that the killer was still out there, still evading capture, grew. The media frenzy surrounding the case only intensified after each murder. Newspapers published sketches of the killer based on witness reports, and police even released descriptions of possible suspects. But there was still no breakthrough. The more the police and the public waited for a clue, the deeper the mystery became. The killer seemed to be almost taunting them, always staying one step ahead. The profiling efforts in an attempt to gain insight into the nature of the killer. The police turned to psychological profiling, a relatively new practice in criminal investigations at the time. They sought the help of Dr. Paul Britton, a criminal profiler, who suggested that the killer might be a man with a history of mental illness, someone with violent tendencies. He theorized that the killer was a disorganized individual who didn't plan his attacks meticulously but acted impulsively. Britton's profile highlighted key aspects of the murderer's behavior. He suggested that the killer was probably living alone, working in a manual labor job, and likely to have a history of abusing women. This led to the creation of a more targeted approach, but despite the efforts of the profiler, the police remained in the dark. The fact that most of the women targeted by the killer were sex workers led many to believe that their status made them easy prey, and thus the investigation was more focused on the social environment surrounding prostitution. The police would later admit that this narrowed focus likely delayed the identification of the killer, a breakthrough. The hunt for the killer's major turning point in the investigation came in 1979, when Peter Sutcliffe, a 33-year-old truck driver, was identified as the prime suspect. It was an investigation driven largely by luck. Sutcliffe had been pulled over by the police in a routine traffic stop in 1979 after a witness reported seeing a man who matched the description of the Yorkshire Ripper near one of the murder sites. At the time, Sutcliffe was not yet a prime suspect, but his name was added to the list of individuals who had been questioned by the police. Over the years, however, despite several prior interviews with Sutcliffe, the police failed to link him to the killings until his arrest in January 1981. One of the most significant aspects of Sutcliffe's capture was the fact that he had been questioned repeatedly, but his ability to blend in with the general public and his evasive demeanor had helped him slip through the cracks. Sutcliffe had been able to mask his true nature, presenting himself as a respectable man during interrogations. Sutcliffe's admission and the investigation into his past. Peter Sutcliffe's eventual admission to the murders brought a shocking conclusion to the case. In a chilling interview, Sutcliffe confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper, taking responsibility for the brutal killings that had terrorized the region for years. His motive, however, was unclear. Sutcliffe claimed that he was on a mission from God to kill prostitutes, a statement that echoed the delusions of many serial killers who justify their violent actions with religious or personal beliefs. The investigation into Sutcliffe's past revealed disturbing insights into his psychology. He had been born in 1946 and grew up in a working-class family in Bradford. Sutcliffe was a loner, and many close to him described him as a quiet, reclusive person. His early life had been marked by troubled relationships with women, and his inability to connect with people was a recurring theme in his life. Sutcliffe had even been rejected by women he had been infatuated with, which likely fed his resentment toward them. As the investigation delved into Sutcliffe's past, it became evident that his crimes had a deeper psychological foundation than initially suspected. Sutcliffe had been a person with a history of mental illness, including some psychotic episodes, and he had a distorted view of women. His repeated attempts to kill women before the murders began suggested that his actions were not completely impulsive, but rather part of a disturbing pattern of escalation. The aftermath of Sutcliffe's arrest. Peter Sutcliffe's arrest in 1981 was the culmination of a long and harrowing investigation. The aftermath was felt not only by the victims' families, but by the entire nation. The case raised many questions about how such a dangerous killer had evaded capture for so long. Despite numerous chances for police to catch him, the investigation into Sutcliffe's past revealed several missed opportunities and critical mistakes by the police. Moreover, Sutcliffe's conviction put a spotlight on the flaws within the police investigation itself. Some critics argued that the police were focused on the assumption that the killer was targeting sex workers, which led them to ignore other potential victims who did not fit this mold. Furthermore, the failure to connect the earlier murders with the later ones allowed Sutcliffe to continue his rampage for years. When Sutcliffe was finally convicted in 1981 for the murders of 13 women and the attempted murders of 7 others, it marked the end of a reign of terror that had lasted for nearly 5 years. Sutcliffe's name became synonymous with the Yorkshire Ripper, and his capture was seen as a bittersweet victory for law enforcement and the public alike. The legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most infamous and tragic chapters in British criminal history. The psychological profile of Sutcliffe and the prolonged investigation have left a lasting impact on the way the police approach serial killers. While his capture brought closure to many, the scars left on the victims' families, as well as the fear that gripped the region during those years, are enduring. The investigation and subsequent trial of Peter Sutcliffe sparked an ongoing discussion about the treatment of sex workers, the police's approach to certain types of crime, and the psychological profiles of serial killers. Sutcliffe's case, along with others like it, highlighted the need for greater awareness of the underlying issues that drive individuals to commit such heinous acts. Despite his conviction, the questions surrounding Sutcliffe's motivations, the police's failures in identifying him sooner, and the long-term effects of the case on the public consciousness remain. The Yorkshire Ripper case continues to serve as a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary people and the lasting impact such crimes can have on society. Call to action, CTA. What do you think about the Yorkshire Ripper case and the police investigation that eventually led to Peter Sutcliffe's arrest? Do you believe the police could have caught him sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Room 57 for more chilling true crime stories and in-depth analyses of notorious criminal cases that have shaped history. Part 4, The Aftermath, A Nation Shaken, Lessons Learned, Trial and Conviction of Peter Sutcliffe on May 1981. After years of terror and investigation, Peter Sutcliffe stood trial for the murders of 13 women and the attempted murders of 7 others. The trial took place at the Old Bailey, London, and the country held its breath as the brutal details of Sutcliffe's killings were laid bare in court. The prosecution presented a harrowing picture of a man driven by his deep-seated hatred of women, whose psychotic delusions led him to believe he was on a mission from God to rid the world of prostitutes. Sutcliffe's defense team raised the argument that he was suffering from mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, and that he was not responsible for his actions. They painted a picture of a man who was delusional and incapable of understanding the true nature of his crimes. The defense even presented psychiatric evidence that suggested Sutcliffe's delusions were the driving force behind his violent behavior. However, the prosecution painted a different picture of Sutcliffe, one of cold, calculated violence. They argued that, despite his apparent mental illness, Sutcliffe was in full control of his actions during the murders. He was not a man who simply snapped in a moment of madness, but someone who had carefully planned and executed his crimes, methodically selecting his victims and using tools to evade detection. His ability to function normally in everyday life contradicted his defense of insanity, and the jury ultimately found him guilty. Peter Sutcliffe was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. His conviction marked the end of his reign of terror, but it did not bring an immediate sense of closure for many, particularly the victims' families. The impact on the victims' families. The families of Sutcliffe's victims were, of course, the most affected by his actions. Each of the 13 women he killed had their lives ripped away violently, and their families were left to grapple with the grief and trauma of their loss. What made this case even more tragic was the fact that many of Sutcliffe's victims were marginalized women prostitutes whose deaths were often not treated with the same level of urgency or respect as those of other women in society. This perception, unfortunately, played a role in delaying the investigation and compounded the pain of those left behind. The families, many of whom had to endure years of uncertainty as the investigation unfolded, struggled with feelings of anger and helplessness As each murder occurred, they were forced to wait for justice while living in constant fear that their loved one could be next. And even after Sutcliffe's arrest, the trauma of losing a loved one to such a brutal killer remained with them for years. The case also raised difficult questions about the way society views sex workers. Many felt that the deaths of these women had been minimized due to the stigma surrounding their profession, although there was no evidence to suggest that Sutcliffe's motivations were driven by any societal judgment of his victims' occupations. The fact that many of them were sex workers made the case even more complicated. The exploitation and marginalization of these women by society and by the justice system at large had lasting repercussions, and many began to argue for greater empathy and recognition for the victims of such crimes. As the years passed, some families of Sutcliffe's victims continued to speak out, demanding justice for their loved ones, while others found solace in the knowledge that Sutcliffe would never walk free again. But the grief of losing a loved one to such a monster lingered far beyond the courtroom. Some victims' families, like those of Barbara Leach and Jacqueline Hill, found it difficult to accept Sutcliffe's claims of mental illness, feeling that he had evaded justice and responsibility for his actions for far too long. The broader public reaction and psychological impact of the Yorkshire Ripper case had a profound effect on the public. The terror and fear caused by the murders left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the British public, particularly in the Yorkshire region. People were afraid to go out after dark, especially women, and the sense of safety that many had once felt was shattered. Sutcliffe's ability to evade capture for so long created a deep sense of frustration and mistrust of the police. Public confidence in the police investigation also suffered. The fact that Sutcliffe had been questioned multiple times over the years but had still managed to avoid capture fueled anger and disbelief. There was a sense that the authorities had failed to protect the victims, and many felt that the investigation had been misdirected by focusing too much on sex workers and not enough on the killer's psychological profile. The media, too, played a role in shaping public opinion. The relentless coverage of the murders and the fear-mongering fueled public anxiety, turning Sutcliffe into an almost mythical figure. For many, the name Yorkshire Ripper became synonymous with fear itself. The media, eager to capitalize on the horror, published sensationalized headlines that only further added to the public panic. This constant barrage of fear-laden news reports amplified the sense of unease in society, particularly among women. Moreover, the case raised difficult questions about the nature of serial killers and the psychology behind their actions. Many wondered what drove Sutcliffe to kill, and how a person could commit such horrific acts without remorse. Experts debated whether Sutcliffe was born with a predisposition for violence, or whether he had been shaped by his difficult childhood and troubled relationships. His claim that he was on a mission from God added another layer of complexity, as it suggested that Sutcliffe's actions were not simply the result of personal hatred, but also linked to deeply rooted psychological issues. Lessons learned from the investigation of the Yorkshire Ripper case was a wake-up call for law enforcement in the UK, and it led to a re-evaluation of the methods used in criminal investigations. The investigation highlighted the importance of psychological profiling in understanding serial killers, and in the years that followed, law enforcement agencies began to make greater use of criminal psychologists and profilers in the pursuit of violent offenders. The failure to catch Sutcliffe sooner also prompted changes in how the police handled evidence. The case illustrated the importance of connecting seemingly unrelated crimes and using forensic evidence to build a case against suspects. It became clear that Sutcliffe had been under the radar for much of the investigation, despite his numerous interactions with law enforcement. This failure to see the patterns in his crimes highlighted a need for more sophisticated investigative techniques. Sutcliffe's eventual capture and conviction marked the end of the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror, but it left an enduring legacy for British law enforcement. As one of the most infamous serial killers in history, Sutcliffe's case became a case study in criminal investigations and psychology. Law enforcement learned valuable lessons about the importance of a systematic approach to criminal profiling, the use of forensic evidence, and the need for a broader perspective when it came to identifying and capturing serial offenders. Peter Sutcliffe's life in prison and legacy after his conviction. Sutcliffe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, where he would spend the remainder of his life. His mental health continued to be a subject of debate, with some claiming that Sutcliffe was genuinely schizophrenic, while others argued that he was simply a cold-blooded killer who had manipulated the system to avoid facing justice for his actions. Sutcliffe's time in prison was marked by frequent mental health evaluations, but he never truly expressed remorse for the lives he had taken. He maintained his claim that he had been acting under the influence of divine command, although there was little evidence to support this notion. Instead, many psychologists believe that Sutcliffe's actions were driven by a combination of misogyny deep-seated resentment toward women, and a psychopathic inability to feel empathy. Sutcliffe's legacy, however, is not just one of terror and tragedy, it is also a reminder of the dark forces that can shape human behavior and the failures in systems of justice that allow such killers to roam free. For the families of the victims, Sutcliffe's death in November 2020, after a battle with COVID-19, may have provided some closure, but it could never truly replace the loved ones they lost to his violent spree. What are your thoughts on the Yorkshire Ripper case? Do you believe the investigation could have been handled differently? What lessons can we learn from the failures in this case? Leave your comments below. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you found this case analysis insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Room 57 for more true crime stories, chilling investigations, and in-depth discussions on some of the world's most notorious criminal cases. Also, hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new uploads from us. Stay tuned for more true crime stories that continue to haunt history. Thank you for watching.